In the last video, we looked at how do we use MySQL as part of a backend to make an endpoint. In this particular video, we will cover some leftover concepts related to the same topic. So it is better if you have already seen the previous video. Here we are going to just cover the additional options that are available to us as part of CRUD repository, and how do we define some other endpoints, some other methods on the same endpoint. So let's get started. If you look at, let's first look at our repository that we created. Our CRUD repository, our repository was an extension of CRUD repository, and we had only defined one method in it, which was basically finding an entity by email or username. Now the reason that we did because we know that we define within the system, we want to define a user to have a unique email as well as a unique username. Now programmatically we can do that, but many times when we are looking at a product, sometimes we may be importing data from outside. So only programmatic checks are not sufficient. We need to bring these constraints right down to the database level. So earlier we had defined this user entity with just @entity annotation. Now that would, if you have just the @entity annotation, the Hibernate will create the table based on its own logic, and basically what it does is, if you have a name that is capitalized, for every capital letter that is in the middle of that word, it will put an underscore. So user entity will become user underscore entity. Now if you want to, most of the time this is a good idea, but sometimes you might be inheriting a schema and you want to use the same table names, and in some other scenarios you might want to give your own table names. So the best way to do it is use @table annotation, and basically the way it works is you say @table and the name equal to, basically this name would essentially define the name of the table. So I want to just create a table with the name user. Now other main issue is that the table that we have created, we have already decided that the email and username should be unique. Now you could in theory be inheriting some data from some outside. So it is always a good idea to enforce uniqueness right at the database level rather than programmatically doing it within your code. So we can do that by defining unique constraints within these annotation, and the way it really works is we say unique constraints equal to, and then we can say unique constraint. This is a name, that is the name of the constraint. So you can come up with a nomenclature. I just put uq underscore the list of the columns, and then we say column names equal to, in this case it is email. Similarly we can just copy paste this thing and we put a comma at the end of it, and the second constraint that we want is on the username, and the column name is username. Now we have defined these constraints. Now in MySQL, sometimes because we have just, if you see our column definitions, we have just used them as private string, and most of the time these will map to a varchar 255, and because we are using the default thing and it is a UTF-8, sometimes you run into the risk of having an index that is larger than 1000 characters, and MySQL starts giving error there. So we can restrict it by putting this column annotation, and specifying the length to be. Now a email cannot be, let's say maximum email that we want to allow is 128 characters. So that we do here, and similarly maximum username is, I think 64 is good enough. Similarly for email we want to restrict it to a length of 128. So with this, now we are restricting the length of these two things, and now let's try to run it and see what happens. If you see here, you are seeing this SQL that is getting generated, and this SQL is it's very important sometimes to debug it, and the way you can do it is by there is some error that we are seeing here. We will get to that. Basically you can enable this detailed SQL to be generated by adding a couple of lines in your application.properties file. So if we go to our application.properties file, you actually see these two lines, which is hibernate.format SQL true, and dialect is this, and show SQL to be true. So this is sometimes useful for debugging purposes. Now let's see what has happened to our so the table did not get generated, so there seems to be some issue, and let's try to figure it out what is happening. So let's look at our log that we got. So here it is giving, this is the SQL that got generated, and we are getting some error with respect to this SQL. So let's try to figure out that error. It will be, so it's not liking type equal to InnoDB basically in the thing. So so to start with, we can just comment out this dialect thing, let it choose the default, and let's run it. Yeah, now it is successful, and we can go and look at the schema. The table is now generated. If I do show create table, if you see, there are now two unique keys generated, one for email, one for username. The length of the username field is restricted to 64, and length of email field is restricted to 128. So these are the important things that we need to know, because we want to make sure our Hibernate code is in sync with what is happening in the database. Now let's look at some of the other things that we want to do. For example, one of the things that we would want to do is allow a user to modify some of the fields. Now we can take a opinion that, oh, we are not going to allow somebody to change their username, but we would have to allow people to change their email, and there may be additional fields that we want people to change. So how do we do that? To do that, basically we need to go to our endpoint that we had defined, and let's look at our user endpoint, and we define we actually define a method that would allow us to modify the user. And generally there are two methods that could be used for this purpose. There is a put method and there is a patch method. There is a little bit of a difference between put and patch method, and from the point of view of the standard, and let's see what those are. So semantically what the standard says is that put method will supply a modified version of the object and update an existing object. So basically you take a new object, put it in the place of the older object, while the patch method will essentially give you instructions to modify the resource. So for example, when you are, let's say, change of the password, when you are changing the password, you are only going to supply the password, and that is a good example of a patch method. While if you want to update the whole object, the put method is a good method to use. In our case, let's say we know that we are not going to allow many of the fields to change, but we will allow some fields to change. So for example, let's say we define patch method, we get the key is the ID, and then we don't want a path variable, we want let's say we want the request body to come in, and so we will have a path variable because we already have it there, but we add another request body and let's call it user entity, and we say updated object. So now once we get it, the first thing that we have to do is we look into the database. If the object is found, if it is found, then this is where we are going to update it. So what we do is, let's say there are only two fields which we want to allow to be updated. One is, let's say, the email address, and other is, let's say, the password. So basically what we are going to do is we will check if updated object dot get password is equal to let's get the user entity stored object equal to OUE dot get, and here we check stored object dot get password. If they are not equal, then we basically want to set stored object dot set password to updated object dot get password. And similarly we want to check for, let's say, email. So we say if updated object email is not equal to stored object email, then we want to set email updated object dot get email. And once we have, we can save the object. So we can say user repository dot save stored object, and once we do that, we can return we can get the object back using the query, and it should be present by now, and just return it. That will be the best and simplest way to we can just do it in one line. So basically we get the object, if it is available, we compare the field that we expect to have changed and update those fields, then we save the object, and then we find it again from the database so that we are returning what is actually present in the database. And if it is not present, we just throw an exception that user does not exist. So this is one example where we are essentially changing we are allowing only particular fields of a user to be changed, and we have defined it as a patch method. Similarly, there are other methods that we may want, like I talked about put, where the whole object. Now in many cases that may make sense, and this is depending on the design of your product. In some cases these things make sense, and in some other cases these things do not make sense. So if it makes sense for you, you could go ahead and define it. If it doesn't, if it is now here there is a small check that we need to make sure that if the user does not supply the password, then we have to do a null check. So let's do updated password dot get password is not equal to null, and it is not equal to this, then only we do it. Same thing we want to do it here. Updated object dot get password, in this case we are talking about email. Get email is not equal to null, because if we call the equals on a null reference, we are going to get a null pointer exception. So this is about the patch method, which is important, and you could use patch and put. Some cases you may want to define patch because you always want certain fields only to be allowed to be changed. And when we are using patch, the incoming request need not be the original object. We might actually create a new object which is a key value pair or a name value pair, where we say the field name is password and the new value is this, and the field name is email and the value is this. So you could use patch in that way also. While put, in terms of the standard of it, you could programmatically you could do it anyway, but as per the standard you should be providing a new user entity object that replaces already existing user entity object. So now let's test this functionality, whether the patch is working now. So we run our application. This application is up. Let's go back to our trusty old Postman. Now we have cleaned up the database, so let's first create some users. So let's go and we do a post again, and we are going to create the same good old user one from yesterday. So we do a post and the user one gets created. Let's also create a user 2 now, and we can get all of them. So now you can see, because we cleaned up the database, the IDs are reset to 1 and 2 again. Now we want to modify. So let's take one of the post requests, and we will change the post request to patch because that's the operation that we defined, and we are going to change the user 2. So the URL has 2 now because that was our path variable, and let's say rather than writing 2 this way, I want to write 2 this way, and email also we want it to be this way, and let's send it. So now you can see it still shows the old one. So let's just get all and see what is happening. And yeah, so it kind of did not change. The user 2 did not change. So we have to figure out what went wrong. Let's look at our patch request again. Username is user2, full name is this, email is this, and we did the patch request. Let's try sending it again. Okay, so if you remember our code, okay, so this is the thing. If you remember our code that we did, we only allowed 2 fields to change, the password and the email. We did not really allow the username to change because we said it will remain constant. and in this case we have not put any password, so email didn't get changed, so it is working the way it is supposed to work. If you see, the email has become user2. The only other field that we allow to change is the password. So for example, we could remove all this, remove this as well, and set a password request where password is user to password 123 hash, and if we send it, now you see the password has changed. So yeah, it is working the way it is expected to work. I got a little bit confused with which field we are allowing to change, and here also if you can see, it sends the right values. So yeah, that's the patch method for you. Now of course it's not a good idea to have password in the text, and we will cover that in one of the later videos. Right now it is just to show you how you can create a REST endpoint, use patch, put, post methods, and delete, get to perform certain operations, and how do you add custom methods to your repositories so that you can do things other than what is provided out of box. So I think with this, this kind of covers the whole idea of how to define a basic endpoint using Spring Framework. So I think that kind of completes most of what we intended to do with respect to repositories. Of course it is a detailed subject, and you can play with it, and you can figure out in how many different ways you can use it. But for now I think for the purpose of this particular video and what I intended to cover, this kind of covers it. And if you have liked this video, please subscribe the channel, please hit the bell icon, share it with other people who might be interested in this content, and thank you for watching. Please look out for the next video where I would be covering some other topics. One of the things that I want to cover in one of the next videos is many times when we are writing these simpler applications, we don't really want to use Tomcat, because Tomcat is an extremely heavy server, and if you are deploying into the cloud, it is going to cost you, because your CPU sizes will increase more, everything increases more. So for most of the purposes, Jetty is a pretty good lightweight server. So in one of the next videos I want to explain how do we replace Tomcat with Jetty, because you end up saving a lot of money in terms of the compute that you deploy your service on. So as I said, thank you for watching, and see you in the next video.